which was even in those days a sort of illicit, cosmopolitan, sexually quite dangerous place. So women out on the public streets were often approached by men thinking that they were on the game and looking for business. And this is why these new facilities work so hard to create an air of respectability and legitimacy. The other area where women have a difficult role being in public spaces were charity workers, and the first, if you like, welfare professionals. So, as you'll know from reading Mrs. Beeton, the act of charity was a hugely important thing for women to engage in. And many women acted as so-called Lady Bountifuls and went round to the homes of the working poor, offering their advice on how working women could better manage their homes. Just what everybody needs, some do-gooder coming with lots and lots of money, coming to who's probably never been in the kitchen in her life, coming into your home to tell you that you're cooking in a very inefficient way and really you should raise your children in different types of ways. But that was an enormous part of the work for respectable women in the second half of the 19th century. There were 20,000, by the late 19th century, there were 20,000 salaried charity workers, women charity workers, and another 500,000 working voluntarily. And then on top of that, in the first decade of the 20th century, you have health visitors, state health visitors, you have district nurses, you have sanitary inspectors, some of whom were women, and you have education officers, some of whom were women. So suddenly you have this new professional group of women whose work is to have a detailed knowledge of working class neighborhoods. And they're out on the streets, in public places, by themselves. Well, I'm going to do this and then we'll stop for questions. So obviously the great fear was prostitution. Okay? Prostitution was liberalism's great horror. It was the ultimate proof of what happens to free labour in the marketplace. This is an unregulated marketplace where people could make free choices. Was one argument. The other was prostitution is a product of the very social conditions wrought by industrialization. Either way, prostitution was a type of horror for the advocates of liberalism. It's estimated that in London, in the middle of the 19th century, there was one prostitute for every 12 adult males. Stunning amount, which basically meant there was about 55,000 prostitutes, although the police estimated it at about half of that figure. Who were they? Well, they're basically pretty much as prostitutes are today, young women, often under the ages of 22, often children. Anyone know what the age of consent was in Britain before 1885? Go on, Tom. Not bad guess. Very good. 12. 12. 12. It raised to 16 in 1885. You know, these people are usually between jobs. They've run away from home. They've been abandoned by their parents. They're out of work. They're homeless. All the, age-old conditions of prostitution applied in the 19th century. But they were increasingly visible. That is to say, they became, because they were seen to be such a problem, because they seemed to represent everything that liberalism wasn't very good at doing or was too good at doing. They were constantly exposed by journalists as a truly shocking social problem. And the best example of this is this great expose by W.T. Stead in the Pall Mall Gazette in 1885 of a child prostitution network called, the story was called The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon. Prostitutes, therefore, became increasingly targets of intervention, and that came in two types of ways. One, there were those people, often Anglican priests, often men of letters like Charles Dickens used to do this, William Gladstone, the Prime Minister, used to do this, of going out to talk to fallen women and to try to lead them and to morally reform them. So Dickens created a house for prostitutes to go to where they could rebuild their house. Those types of initiatives were always far too inadequate and impractical. And the state quickly intervenes in increasingly coercive ways on the problem of prostitutions through the Contagious Diseases Acts, of which there is a whole series, as you can see from the slide behind me. Now, the Contagious Diseases Acts came in not because people were worried actually about the condition of the conditions that prostitutes were living in. They came in because they were concerned about the state of the military. They were concerned about the way in which the military seemed racked with STDs or venereal disease in particular. So it was thought, for instance, after these two big military embarrassments of the revolt in India and the Crimea in the 1850s, that 1 in 3 soldiers on inspection were found to have venereal disease. And this was seen to not only enfeeble the bodies of these men, but to demoralize the military as a whole. So what they did was they turned their attention not to reforming the soldiers, but to reforming the prostitutes. And in garrison towns, so those towns where there are military barracks, they began to forcibly inspect prostitutes suspected of having an infectious disease. Forcibly inspected with I've forgotten what it's called. Capula? Speculum, thank you. With a steel speculum, and locked up in a hospital, in a lock hospital, for 3 months until they could prove to be clear of the disease. The 1866 Act, that was the 1864 Act that I was just describing, the 1866 Act allowed the police to inspect women every 2 weeks. And the 1868 Act made prostitutes have to carry identity cards, one of the first experiments with identity cards, and extended the stay in lock hospitals for up to 9 months. And it also extended it beyond garrison towns. So a very, very coercive, physically appalling and invasive set of procedures by the state, by a liberal state. Okay, by a liberal state engaging in this type of highly interventionist and physically coercive form of policing. Of course, this animated a whole series of responses to it, most famously by a woman called Josephine Butler, who was really one of the first pioneers of the feminist movement in Britain. And she really began the campaign against the Contagious Diseases Act. And what it did was develop a critique that became hugely important to the women's suffrage movement and to feminist politics more broadly into the 20th century, which was to say that the Contagious Diseases Act, for her, exposed what she called the double standards of the double standard of the ideology of separate spheres. It exposed the sort of masculinity of the nature of the state. So she just said, why punish these women when it's actually the real problem is men's uncontrollable desire? It's men, not women, who are captive to their own biology, not women. And moreover, what these men do is go out and pick up an STD and then take it back into their angel in the home, back into the so-called morally pure place of the home. So the whole ideology of separate spheres, she said, was a complete nonsense that actually exposed its fundamental contradictions. Women were not protected by men. Men were, in fact, the predators who destroyed women's moral purity. Now, the size of the Contagious Diseases Act, the movement against the Contagious Diseases Act, was not massive. Okay? There were 900 meetings between 1870 and 1885, some 17,000 petitions, about 2.5 million signatures. It's not a massive popular mobilization. But the critique that it develops is absolutely central to what happens at the women's movement and in feminist politics in the 20th century. And it is to that exciting story that we shall now turn. But does anyone have any questions about those previous sections? Yes, at the back there. So your name, I've forgotten it. Rain. Say that again, I can't, the bells.
The professional women,
yeah.
Like nurses, were they married, were they widows, and what was it?
Well, they could have been all of the above. The question is the women professional workers, the educational inspectors, the district nurses, the health visitors, were they married, widowed, or unmarried? And they could be all of the above. They were generally unmarried, respectable middle-class women, who many of whom, when they got married, ceased to do that work, but some very famously continue to do it throughout their marriage. And that's in part because of the changing political landscape that I'm about to describe that meant that those types of professional opportunities continued to be available. Yes? Mm-hmm. Say the question again. Let me process it. Yeah. Yes. 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 It basically protects women precisely from that eventuality. Yeah.
Was the Contagious Diseases Act actually reduce the rate of prostitution?
That I can't tell you. On that bombshell. Yeah, go on then. Last question.
For education, like if you didn't buy governance for your son before boarding school, like you did some in boarding schools, like if they did not get an education, like if you're a working class.
Oh, well, if they were working class, they would almost certainly not have an education. But there were various church schools, and there were local charity schools that particularly the respectable working classes might get to, if they're a really smart kid.
When did like common public education?
1870 is the beginning of compulsory elementary education up to